In my experience, extensive reading has often been dismissed as something impractical for a higher education classroom, or rather something not necessarily practical for a more content-led classroom. However, I do not believe this is so, and as someone like all of you here at this conference advocate for extensive reading, today I'd like to share some ideas about how this method can be built into a content instruction course. So I'm Mike Brandon from Hanyang University here in Seoul, Korea, and thank you very much for taking the time to check out this particular video presentation. There will be a separate Zoom for Q&A, which will be noted at the end of this presentation video. And of course, a big acknowledgement to extensive reading around the world for putting this conference together and allowing us to share a lot of really interesting ideas. So today I hope to contribute to our conference by just taking a look at the following elements. First, the actual issue that I've introduced in the beginning there, which is what are the actual problems with extensive reading in higher education? Why is it not such a widespread methodology? And then how it can actually be supported in higher education. And then I'm just going to very quickly give some examples of how I've implemented certain digital methods to try to promote an actual strong pedagogical culture around extensive reading in a higher education classroom. With my experience, there are, of course, many pitfalls that I'd also like to indicate, and then I'd like that to lead to some more open discussion, particularly those who have also implemented this type of methodology in this context. So let me just begin with my own context. As I mentioned, I am actually at a higher education institution in South Korea, and in particular, I implement extensive reading in a content and language integrated learning course. What that means is that there is core content around social science and humanities topics, which the students must learn and do the assignments on. However, running consistently in the background is the idea that there should be a degree of language development, and the language development skill is reading. So let's just start by looking at what the problems are with extensive reading in higher education. One of the first issues, of course, is you face multiple language proficiency levels. It's not often or in many cases even impossible to level students for this type of course. Now, many universities in non-native English contexts do have English language programs in higher education, but that's not what I'm focusing on here. I'm focusing on the content classes that take place in higher education. Now, the issue, of course, is you look at the front row of students, and if you imagine number 1 is the lowest proficiency and number 5 is basically native-like fluency, you instantly have your first problem. How do you implement extensive reading with such a wide variety of students? Now, of course, you may be thinking of different methods and different texts, but I'm going to come on to why that's such a problematic issue a little bit later. So some solutions to this would be, of course, grouping by level, assigning text by level. You know, you're going to divide classes, there's going to be different assignments or texts, and you're looking at developing the student reading ability. That's what would typically happen in an exclusively extensive reading classroom. But the reality, of course, in higher education is that we need to have, well, enrollment isn't always the choice of the student. Sometimes it's a necessity that they are in that classroom in the first place. Or they just have total autonomy in the types of classes they wish to join, in which case they may like the title of the course, they may be very interested in the content, but it doesn't necessarily mean that their proficiency is going to match that. And of course, in many higher education institutions, especially with this new massification of higher education that we see, the institution is often focused on enabling student choice rather than really what is the best fit for a particular student. Also, a higher education course is lacking a lot of the development time, which is often available in regular teaching. So my experience working in a more open high school public system, I had a lot more time to develop the students in the more rapid semester which takes place in higher education. And also, and this is really the big pitfall, If there's going to be a content-led course at a university, which is going to give credits, these credits may be transferable internationally, the texts and assignments have to be standardized. There can't be multiple texts taking place in that type of classroom. So of course, the multiple proficiency level really becomes problematic because the typical solutions cannot be actually enacted upon in the classroom. As pointed out, of course, course credits, they must be equal. A student taking part must do the same work and have the same experience to honor the credits they are actually being receiving. And things get even worse because there are also multiple schematic knowledge levels. Now, a course could be open to many different majors, in which case you're receiving students who may be extremely expertise. So as the example I gave earlier with a course based more in the social sciences and philosophy, students who have already experienced these content areas are going to experience a reading much more differently, or much differently, shall I say, to students who are just entering a course out of interest, maybe an engineering student, etc. And the same applies anyway, even if they're all from the same area or major. And note, this is the part where extensive reading methodology is pretty much, I would argue, similar to a native speaker and the actual language learner, because the vocabulary and their interaction with it could be totally new to them. Also, the context to which cases in a book are given are also going to be different based on the schematic levels. So with all of that, is extensive reading really suitable for higher education? Well, here's the thing. Active learning and strong pedagogy are necessary in all teaching contexts. Simply put, lecturing does not work. Certainly, in no way does lecturing work in any equivalence to an actual active learning environment. Extensive reading really enables the active learning environment, reasons I will demonstrate later, and I'm sure you're aware of as well. And it enables us to move away from this idea of you may have experienced yourself, in comes the lecturer, and you're going to spend 2 hours while they essentially read from a PowerPoint or they read from a text, which you could have read elsewhere. And this is where extensive reading is so powerful a tool in higher education, I would argue, because you can take that reading out of the classroom and make it habitual for the student, not something the student must suffer in order to eventually take the exam to get the credit. And as research has showed, there's a significantly higher failure rates compared in classes which have a lecture method compared to active learning. If you're a higher education educator, you owe it to your students not to lecture them. And of course, reading and of course writing are basically the disciplinary distinctive aspects of higher education. This is what makes something different. A text in engineering or chemical engineering is vastly different to a text in English literature, of course, which really places the argument for extensive reading right at the center of higher education pedagogy. So what I advocate then, content courses need a strong pedagogical backing. Again, think back to maybe your times at university, and you may have gone through the experiences where you thought, why didn't I just read the book? Why didn't I just get these PowerPoint slides and read them in 10 minutes by myself? Why am I in this place? There needs to be something behind the course. And this is where I'm going to explain why I utilize extensive reading in content-led courses. So typically there would be the core text, and then there may be expected additional reading. Read one chapter from this book each week, and here are some journal articles or other articles of interest related to that text. That might be a typical course. There may be a discussion seminar, etc. Again, all weak, very weak classroom methods, actually, to promote learning. Extensive reading, though, allows us to get away from this. Because what we want is to have the core text read outside the classroom in order to then enable the contents of that text to be part of an active classroom. Thus, we can implement actual learning strategies into our class. And of course, if those learning strategies are cooperative, it really sets the sense of why a student is reading a text, how it relates to themselves and how it relates to other students, and also the synchronous learning that takes place in a classroom can really be pulled out, and students can get a lot more meaning from a text. When they see their peers reading, they get a lot more encouragement to see that there's a real benefit to understanding and gaining more out of a text. And if you're familiar with reading circle strategies, you have an opportunity here with the multiple proficiency levels to implement different roles for the different students in groups. As a result, those students in the different roles can then actually participate in a level that may befit their actual level within the class, but also the group together is coming together as one to get the full meaning and encourage the full understanding of the text, while also enabling different interpretation. That's a lot of a mouthful, but it's all the benefits that extensive reading offers, and why I would argue it's a really effective strategy in higher education, especially as it cultivates independent reading. One of the key skills we look for when you in a student that you want to develop is that lifelong habitual reading. And that idea, as we know from big advocates in the extensive reading field like Crescent, etc., the love of reading is what's so key. This is essential for second language learners, and I would also argue it's also essential for native speakers as well. And it's something I think we all miss often from the content classrooms that we have, that we go through at university. Now, remember, my context, of course, is that there has to be there should be some language elements anyway, because of the international context of the higher education. So this is the ideal part of implementing extensive reading in this way. But of course, there is a lot of cognitive bias in the studies that even though we know that using strong pedagogy in higher education proves that students perform better, still cognitive bias demonstrates that students feel they learn more when they have a field expert lecturing them, even though their performance is far lower. So some of these ways of selling extensive reading, again, there should be a lot of familiarity with you there, but these are what I approach from. But it does actually, we know it improves students holistically with vocabulary acquisition, increasing their reading speed, and reducing the frustration of reading text as they gain prediction and identifying redundant parts of text. It has a knock-on effect on other language skills like writing and speaking, etc. But of course, the problem with this is students may feel, why am I reading the text? Why are you telling it to me? I feel like I'll learn more if you're an expert telling me. And this is one of the always the big problems with actually implementing pedagogy in higher education. And that is basically students have that feeling that they're learning more from the lecture. However, we know that that doesn't actually function that way. And we as teachers have a moral duty, an ethical duty to actually promote the skills needed for lifelong learning. And of course, extensive reading fulfills the goals of higher education. And this is really, I think, one of the big selling points of extensive reading in this method. Students with low English proficiency can enhance critical thinking skills through applying those skills into reading itself. And also, actual pedagogical intervention from the reading allows the development of those critical stances in reading. However, as I stated earlier, the demands of having to have a standard syllabus that all students must go through and experience in the same way, or at least in the same timeline, really threatens to basically put extensive reading onto the shelf. It's not possible to do that in a content-led classroom in higher education. However, I'm going to argue that digital methods give us a good way of actually really getting at this. And let me demonstrate why. Typically, in an analog method, we'd have a vocabulary list, reading roll sheets, text-specific activities. You get groups together to present on characters or meaning, or case studies presented in a text, depending on the complexity of the text. However, this can be quite impractical in a higher education classroom. So let's look at some digital methods. Vocabulary lists can be expanded upon through the cloud. There's apps like Quizlet, etc., which highly promotes the equivalence, the equivalent methods in developing student vocabulary. And the key thing is as well is students can all contribute asynchronously to many of these applications. We can actually take those reading rule sheets and put them into asynchronous cloud-based environments, which I'd like to give a demonstration later. And also, we can move these things into cloud applications like Jamboards, etc. as well. This actually allows a lot of the time-saving issue with extensive reading in higher education. And also because all students and the teacher can see in real time what's developing in each group, weaker students who are struggling with the reading, rather than shrinking away, they become more active, especially if you implement cooperative learning roles, for example, into that setup. It really brings those students to the front, especially when you can measure it digitally. Whereas sometimes in analog methods, it kind of gets a little bit pushed to the side. Remember, reading should be done alone, not in the classroom, etc. We should be using the classroom actively to get the meaning for the content from the extensive reading. Interpreting the text needs to be social, and this is why the cloud has really given us the opportunity to bring that social method to make it a consistent thing that students can always access, and also have the active real-time experience in the classroom, which is also being updated in real time as well. So for example, typically a reading circle, and by all means, these are extremely effective if you are in my experience in a public education classroom, and I have the students consistently in the same spot, the same place. Really easy to switch these around, etc., etc. However, a digital reading circle will be basically the same idea, but all the students would update the same document. Now, this may seem like an obvious turn, but if you've not utilized this method, there are many benefits for this, which I can demonstrate, being that you as an educator can access this document directly and even speak outside of the classroom, update, give comments that would take a lot of time live in the classroom. Again, it moves this type of work into something that becomes consistent, habitual for the student, and isn't eating into the other things you can do to create an active classroom around extensive reading. It's also very easy to take things from the student's cloud document, make it available to all students, or move elements into another document for sharing, etc., etc. Imagine discussion questions, rather than writing them on paper, etc. You could actually pop them all up on the board almost instantaneously, and then the classroom can move on with far more effect. As you can see here, even when the student is actually editing, you can easily comment and the student can edit, and you can also cut and clip and just move things around and just have that level of interactivity. Another example perhaps would be students have read a chapter, etc., etc., and I'm going to read character posters. I should also note I'm using Charlotte's Web as the example simply because it's more familiar to us rather than showing a more hardcore academic text in this presentation. But you imagine students that exchange ideas, they present their work in groups, perhaps students move around a room, etc., and they get to present to each other. Okay, that's a very effective strategy. But we need, if you want to promote a more active classroom, activities like Google Jamboards can be quite effective because all students can see the character development as it's going on. And this is where it's key for extensive reading, because not only does it encourage students to be more active because they know their work is going to be shared and demonstrated, it gives the opportunity for, again, asynchronous in real time and keeping a digital record of access for the students to see how others interpret the same text and present information on that text. So let me just give you that example as well. Like before, students can all work at the same time, and this can easily be shared amongst all students as well. However, we do need to be careful, and actually the examples I've shown you are extremely simple digital applications and tools. They're not complicated at all. So you may be thinking, if you're thinking, I came into this thinking I'm going to get a whole new training into getting a new tool. But the first problem is we actually have to be realistic. What are we trying to achieve? And many examples of educational technology barely pass the substitution level in this comparison of the SAMR model from Rubin Pentadera and how it aligns with Bloom's taxonomy. The ultimate example of educational technology, if you're not familiar with this SAMR model, is something that totally redefines a classroom. However, that is quite difficult to achieve. Generally, so you want to aim for augmentation. The previous two methods I showed you are more examples of substitution moving into augmentation, but that's fine. What we're doing is, especially with extensive reading, we want to encourage habitual reading outside of the classroom and then use the classroom to enable active learning. Now, there are possible pitfalls as well here. If you're going to use the EdTech methods that I've explained, again, you don't want students wasting time in class just piecing together a text. And always there are students who are not reading the text who can easily try and fill in there or hide. The digital methods help prevent that. However, this idea that because students have phones or we're using computers all day, we are now able to navigate any digital platform. Well, it's come to the point where this idea of digital natives, which was coined for over several decades almost ago now, the main point is that basically you can't just expect students to get into an application. I've said extensive reading, you want to encourage that development, bring it into an active classroom. If you're spending time training students in an EdTech application, you're wasting the time in the class. So you want more simple applications. Students might be new to Google Documents or any other cloud-based document format you want to use, but they should understand the basic fundamentals, and it's quite quick to do. Jamboards, by equivalence, sometimes it takes the students 1 or 2 minutes to go, what's happening here, until they essentially realize it's just an open canvas, just like a whiteboard would be for students to add information to. But some other tools require downloading the application, doing things with the application, etc. That can be something that you'd want to avoid when using these methods. Also, it requires a lot of pre-planning. Once you are implementing certain document templates like cloud documents, like the example I showed earlier, you're committed to that for the semester. It's very difficult to go in and edit it all. You can't just hand out a different piece of paper or say, avoid this, etc. There's a lot more work there. The pre-planning is key to making extensive reading equate into a more active classroom with the digital equivalent methods that I've shown you briefly here. So that is also key. And also, especially if you're going to start having mixed roles, like students looking for different things in each chapter or each part of the text you're identifying, you need to know more about your students, and then you can start perhaps looking at proficiency, or etc., or where students with more schematic knowledge can help the group. And of course, like all discussions of technology, access is, of course, contextual. We cannot always expect our students to have equal access to these methods, and we shouldn't be evaluating them as a result. So to summarize, extensive reading in higher education is difficult to implement. It's not, I think it's more difficult in my experience to implement than in a language course in a public education environment. And of course, students have natural barriers to active learning in higher education anyway. Students seem to love the active classroom in the primary or middle or high school days, but then once they get to university, there's an acceptance that here's the expert talking, I listen, and almost like the knowledge goes into their mind through osmosis. But we know, and studies have shown that this is not the case. So that's another issue. You have to sell these methods. But extensive reading promotes critical reading skills. It promotes reading habits necessary for academic success. Academic success requires a lot of wider understanding, a lot of wider reading. Extensive reading is one of the greatest methods to promote this. And this is why it's such a good method to implement in a content course where you want to encourage critical thinking in your students. And Implementing the digital tools provides more practical and asynchronous methods of learning for the students. It involves your class time becoming more involved, more active, and increasing the responsibility for the students. That's noted. So in this presentation, I've given hopefully an impression of my experiences, why extensive reading is such a useful tool, not in all perhaps higher education classrooms, but certainly there is a strong case for including extensive reading as part of pedagogy in higher education. But I have also highlighted why it's perhaps so difficult to actually implement this, but actually once you've experienced and tried it, you can actually, particularly the digital tools, you can really implement a successful classroom, really bring on student knowledge, and hopefully activate those lifelong reading habits. Those are my experiences. If you've had experiences or you'd like to talk to me more about my experiences doing that, then there is a discussion session in the Zoom breakout rooms with me on Sunday, 7th of August. So I've moved that towards the latter part of the conference. As my understanding, that should be 9 o'clock GMT UK time or 5 o'clock Korea Standard Time. Those are the two times I operate in. However, please check the website to ensure that the breakout room, if you're interested, connects there. I'd be really interested to know if you have used extensive reading in a content class in higher education or just public education. I have a lot of experience there as well. Or you're interested in just knowing a bit more about what actual texts I implemented, what the students did, the kind of assignments we did, and how the classroom flowed, and how I really got to cut down on wasting time in class with reading time and lecture time, and actually bringing the text into an active classroom instead. Thank you for your time. Here's some references of some of the material that I utilized in this presentation, and I will look forward to hopefully talking to you towards the end of the conference schedule. Enjoy the rest of the presentations, and again, thank you to everyone participating for what's been a fantastic conference. Take care.